I just want to share with you some thoughts. I'm a food safety expert, so my background is in food safety, but having worked in Nestle for a decade and in Danone for 5 years, I've had much time to develop a perspective from both the industrial point of view and also from a government point of view, because I was formerly Chief Executive of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. We're, as Miguel suggested, we're confronted with unprecedented challenges. And to respond to those challenges, we're going to have to take a radically new approach to food production and to food consumption. The business as usual is no longer an option, let's put it like that. And one of the key ways that we are starting to rethink food, and not just food safety, is that we've got really now a triangle. In the past, it was very simply about life sciences. We talked about salmonella, and we talked about chemical risks from things like benzopyrene and other contaminants. But we have now also got the power of the development of social sciences and a way of engaging with consumers and with the public generally that we didn't have before. And equally, we have the massive power and the massive development in data science, in the digital sphere, as was mentioned already a few times this morning. One of the challenges, I think it was Catherine that said that we have an enduring challenge with the health of consumers, much of it related to poor diet. And it is rather shocking to see in many countries now in the developing world that the competition between obesity on the one hand and undernutrition on the other. So you've got two forms of malnutrition, effectively. Malnutrition caused by too many calories, and malnutrition caused by too few calories. And on top of that, of course, you've got the challenges of micronutrient malnutrition, micronutrient deficiency. And of course, if children are subjected to deficiencies in micronutrients at critical life stages, at critical windows of development, the damage that's done in those periods of time endures for a lifetime. And Catherine mentioned stunting, which of course is an obvious visible expression of early life malnutrition, but it goes much further than that. It also includes, for example, the effect on cognitive development caused by iron deficiency and other micronutrient diseases. So the impact of that is it impacts the development of the individual, but of course it impacts the individual's potential in the context of contributing to the economy of those countries. And it's important, I think, also to remind people that health is not just the absence of disease or infirmity. Health is actually a state of well-being, which is both expressed physically, mentally, and socially. So stopping or preventing disease is not enough in the context of the definition that the World Health Organization uses. So just to summarize some of the vital statistics in terms of the global health picture. One thing that shocked me when I looked at this recently was that the mortality globally due to non-communicable diseases is far greater now than that of infectious diseases. So non-communicable diseases include, for example, cardiovascular disease and cancers, many of which are related to diet and nutrition. And even with COVID, which of course is our shocking experience of what an infectious disease pandemic can actually do to the world, NCDs are still leading the way. And I think that's also underlined by the observation by the World Health Organization that diet-related risks are greater than tobacco plus unsafe sex plus drug-related deaths. So diet-related risks are far more important than all of the rest of the serious risks put together. Globally, there are more obese, despite the fact that we heard about the 800 million who are suffering undernutrition on a daily basis, the number of obese people is greater than that now of underweight people. And so this is, again, another time bomb. Miguel called attention to the crisis of our time, which is climate, and it is a crisis. But there is the crisis of malnutrition, malhealth, caused also by food. And obesity is the leading one there, because obesity by itself is the precursor for a range of other diseases, notably diabetes, notably cardiovascular disease, for which the healthcare costs are huge. There was a very interesting study a few years back that did some health economics on the potential projected costs of obesity-related diseases in the future. And the costs were in the trillions. So no country and even the planet bear those costs. So the way to fix it is to prevent it. If it's already broken, when we try to fix the problem, we're not going to have the resources actually to go about it. And so then we have, I won't go through the rest of these, but we've got, coupled with that, the issues of growing food allergy incidence and the issues of micronutrient deficiencies, which are relatively easy to fix. These are not high-tech problems, and the solutions are not high-tech. But as Catherine pointed out, one can actually look at it in a different way. You can actually go for supplemental feeding, and supplemental feeding, to use the word of this seminar, is not really sustainable either, because you have to keep doing it. The sustainable solution to these problems are to actually fix the diet in the first place. And if we can do that by facilitating growth of products and foods that are more nutritious, then you actually don't have to start supplemental feeding with some of the micronutrients. One key area of development that we're actually starting to see in the developed world, of course, is personalized nutrition. And this comes out of the recognition that healthcare in its present form, the pharmacotherapy approach, which we've had now for 100 years or more, that really is not sustainable either. And if you look at it from a purely financial point of view, the average return on investment is about 3%. So, from a business point of view, classical pharma is not really a terribly attractive bet either. The risks are huge and the costs of failure are massive. So one way of actually addressing some of those health concerns is, again, a dietary approach, and maybe beyond that, to go for a personalized approach where you tailor the products and you tailor the diets for individual vulnerabilities and susceptibilities. So it could be a genetic-based personalization, for example, or a biomarker-based personalization for individual needs. This is my key slide because I wanted to try and frame the key challenges we've got. In the past, when I started my career in food safety, the key message was food safety is the number one issue, everything else is secondary. And you had to think about one thing at a time. These days, we have to actually map several goals onto the page at the same time. And so one of the key issues is how to track all of these key performance indicators for our business. Now, if we look at it in this slide, it's kind of a five forces approach. We can start with the environmental dimension in terms of pressure on freshwater supplies. The climate issue has already been dealt with. Soil integrity comes up a lot. I think about 30% of the soil in the world is degraded in some way. And so if we don't look after soil, we're going to have an issue. Even in the developed world, we're going to have an issue with the productivity of our agriculture systems. Then we've got the challenges of contaminants coming from either from agriculture or from other human activities, anthropogenic contamination. In parallel with that, we've got the inexorable development of science. So we're finding things we didn't know was there before. One of the great tragedies of our time, and I'm speaking as somebody who, from the generation that grew up reading Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, and the revolution of the birth of the environmental movement in the 1970s and 1980s. It was predicted in the 1970s and 80s that, you know, we would have silent springs in the 1990s. The silent spring never happened, but in many respects, what actually happened was worse, because we are the generation that's done more damage to our planet than any generation before, despite the fact that since the 60s and 70s, we've had more insight and more technology and more science than any other generation ever had. So it's rather upsetting to realize that our science is advancing, and yet the call to action is lagging behind what we actually know we should be doing. There are, you know, many more tools now with which to do risk assessment. So we're starting to react to issues that are not always necessarily as big as the climate crisis, just because they've appeared in the paper and just because it's a new scientific topic. So we see new things like endocrine activity, and endocrine disruptors like bisphenol A, for example, that come up and have to be dealt with. And in recent times, we've had the issue with biocides, and they've had to be dealt with. So we seem to be, because of the way we manage scientific advancements, we seem to be attacking one new crisis at a time, rather than putting it in the big picture and trying to put it in its context and addressing issues in proportion to the size of the risk. So we've got to become much more risk-based in our approach and in our thinking. Then in parallel, of course, we've got the growth in, we've got an issue with trust in food systems. Sadly, in the case of foodborne disease, we're actually seeing more of some types of foodborne disease. An example is Listeria monocytogenes, where in the developed countries, because of the desire to consume more fresh products, you tend to be exposed to more of the organism. And also because of demographics, people are more vulnerable. So we unfortunately see this trend toward more and not less foodborne disease in some countries. And you put that in the perspective of consumers expecting more, it's a big, difficult task for food manufacturers and food companies to address. The social media and the social media tends to amplify issues that were always there. So it's not that it's kind of creating new problems, it's just amplifying the existing ones. And of course, you've got a lot of activity from NGOs who tend to focus on one topic. It would be one issue at a time, pressure groups, for instance. And then we've got the growth of food ethics, which is a good thing, because we're starting to kind of develop a much more healthy perspective on food. And on the business side of things, of course, there is the challenge of food fraud. Food fraud is about $50 billion a year activity around the world. It applies especially to fisheries, but during COVID, we've seen lots of challenges with supply chains, and of course that gives rise to the temptation for food fraud. And equally, businesses see food chains as becoming far more complex, and complexity generates also its risks, and costs are increasing. So whatever we propose and whatever solutions that we have to find going forward, they've got to be sustainable from a business point of view. If margins are low and the capital is not there, then it's going to be very difficult to find traction for some of these proposed ways forward. So business sustainability has got to be factored into the mixture. And then finally, the regulatory aspect. There is a lack of harmonization, and this is regrettable. Codex Alimentarius has done a lot to facilitate international harmonization of food regulations, but there's still a long way to go. And there is, in many respects, in many areas, divergence. The word cooperation has been used quite a lot this morning. And I think this is really important because the different regulatory systems have a lot to learn from each other. We too often hear that the US is light touch and the UK or the Europe is more rigorous, etc., etc. These are false narratives. In fact, there are positives and negatives in each of the regulatory systems. So pitching them against each other is not the solution. The solution is more cooperation and indeed more harmonization and more mutual recognition once we've actually decided what our criteria are for a good regulatory system. But the increasing complexity, of course, does challenge that. And we've got a raft of new products that come on the market, things like CBD oil and cannabis-based food products, which are growing at an immense speed. And that creates its own regulatory challenges as well. Not to mention the fact that we've got this huge shift toward plant-based nutrition as a consequence of the move away from animal-based products. And so that's the kind of not very quick overview of the global challenges that we've got to contend with. And I'm not going to dwell on this slide because it's been said already. Again, it's summarizing the extent to which we're wasting food, and not just wasting food, but we're losing a lot of food as well before the production stage. And so if we separate into the food dimension, which is the consumer end of things, there's a lot more loss of product that could be in the harvest or in storage that we can actually avoid. So overall, we can actually save a lot of our food by reducing both waste and food loss. It's worth pointing out the IPCC's request. I think it's already about 2 years or 3 years old, to consume less meat, milk, cheese, and butter, and move toward a more locally sourced seasonal food. This has been addressed, of course, increasingly by product developers who are seeking to move toward alternative products. But it's important, I think, again, to go back to our important criterion of not losing sight of nutrition in doing this. So we've got to make sure that it's sustainable from a business point of view, it's sustainable environmentally, but also that it's sustainable from a nutritional point of view. So the transition is a lot more complex and a lot more tricky than people actually realize. And if you want to look in the literature, there was an interesting study done by, I think it was Oxford Brookes University. It was one of the, it was a paper about a year ago in the area of nutrition, where they looked at consumers transitioning from animal-based diets to vegan diets, and found that there were serious gaps in their nutrition with respect to, say, calcium, and then projected there could be bone fracture risks associated with that. So we've got, again, to look at the big picture in undergoing these transitions from one diet to another diet. Again, just to summarize, the Sustainable Development Goals have been mentioned many times this morning already, and one or two have been called out specifically, notably number 13 on climate change. But in actual fact, at least 10 of these goals connect some way with food. And I've heard it said that all actually in some way or another will connect with food or water in some way. So if we're addressing the goals, food is an integral part of this process. And in doing that, what the transition is actually giving rise to is a huge shift in the corporate food landscape. I worked for two of the biggest world food companies, and they were your classical dairy-based, pasta, ambient products, etc. The new landscape looks like this. So it's products like Mossa meat and Blue Nalu. And these are really, many of them are cellular agriculture-based companies where you are moving from meat grown on a farm that has legs and a tail to meat grown in a fermenter that is actually based on cells and then harvested from that. Bill Gates has been very vocal in the last few weeks. He's got a new book out, and he's one of the champions, I think, of bringing attention to the world about the risks of climate change. He's a shareholder on one of these, so he's also kind of a champion for an alternative way of food production. And I've got nothing wrong with that, but as of now, we still do not have a standard for comparing one of these products with one of the conventional ones. And we can't fly blind here. It's very important that in looking at the alternatives, that we actually make the transition based on data, and that we're actually moving to a better solution and not actually staying the same, but looking like we're moving forward. And of course, we have a lot of stories around clean meat. I hate the term. It was Paul Shapiro, who is president of the Humane Society in the US, who kind of came up with the term. But and now I think the movement kind of regrets it, because the implication is that the alternative was not clean. And of course, we know from a safety and a health point of view, it wasn't. So I think that's just a flavor of what I wanted to share with you this morning. Looking forward to the panel discussions, and where we can maybe dive a little deeper into it. Thank you.
John, how do you see us addressing the gap in upholding conventional meat production and giving room for the cellular meat production emerging? What are your thoughts on digitalisation within the food system and climate neutrality, especially in regards to transforming our societies when food, water, energy nexus is considered?
I think one of the key points about digitalization and the food system is that the food industry generally lags behind other industries when it comes to digitalization. We speak about Industry 4.0, which is, you know, cyber physical infrastructure, and it's quite developed in some industries, notably aviation, for instance, and some of the advanced manufacturing industries, but not in food. So food has some catching up to do, and it needs some technology investment. And you can go to some parts of the world and you have quite low tech legacy technologies that are certainly not connected to anything else, and they're operating perfectly well and could operate for another 100 years. So in some respects, the digital gap in food means we're in some areas flying blind. We simply don't have data. And we don't have connectivity. So there is a huge opportunity there. And I think in some parts of the world, companies are starting to catch up, and we're seeing more employment of robotics in food manufacturing and in food service. So I think there's a huge opportunity that we will actually see there. And to come to the second question, I think that's a very good question, Iffy. This issue of the gap between, you know, the conventional meat production and then allowing room for alternatives. Conventional, you know, as I said, business as usual in conventional meat and dairy is no longer an option. We've got to find a way of moving some consumption away from those products, but equally that doesn't mean eliminating dairy and eliminating meat, because they play an important role in nutrition. And so we have to, I think, ensure that we improve standards, environmental standards and productivity standards in those traditional agriculture areas. And it's worth saying as well that I think in the case of animal agriculture, animals play an important role as well in landscape management. I lived in Switzerland for 10 years, and it was always nice to wake up to the sound of cowbells and to watch these animals in the fields. So it would be a really sad situation to see the disappearance of the lovely Swiss cow, I would say. So I think it's important that we manage these things on a sustainable basis. Equally, I've been to factory farms, and maybe a factory farm is the wrong word, but when you visit a farm and there are 30,000 animals in sheds, in buildings, it's rather shocking when you've grown up in a rural landscape where cows are outdoors on green grass. So I think we've got to ask ourselves some serious questions from an ethical point of view. What kind of animal agriculture do we want, and what production system is acceptable, and what production system would be unacceptable from an ethical point of view? So there are many questions around it, but it certainly doesn't mean throwing out animal agriculture and throwing out dairying, because I think they're valuable industries, and they have a place and a role to play as well, I think.
Of the various alternative proteins in development, which do you see having the most immediate impact?
There's been a lot of interest in pea protein, obviously, and the seed storage proteins are quite impactful. One of the challenges is going to be, of course, allergy of these proteins, and in addition, how do you incorporate them into products? The good thing about meat and dairy proteins is that they're easy to functionalize and make into sausages, make into cheese, and make into emulsified drinks. To do that with some of the plant proteins, you've got to do a lot of processing, because you may have to degrade some of the anti-nutrients that are in the product. You also may have to add an emulsifier or a stabilizer to do it. So from a technology point of view, it might be challenging. So I think the ones that impress me, corn was a very impressive success story. And I think pea protein is currently on the market. The challenge, of course, is that to incorporate the vast amounts of product that would be demanded by the market, you then have to scale up your agriculture so that you can actually deliver the scale that's needed. And sometimes it isn't foreseeable what those consequences might be. We've been reading in the last few days about the avocado, and suddenly the avocado is wreaking havoc on agricultural systems in countries like Mexico, because they need a lot of water. So one has to actually try and walk through the individual steps in going to scale when you actually make those transitions. But I think the news so far is very encouraging.